I discovered my husband's affair at 66 with my closest friend. The kettle was whistling when Lily tugged my sleeve. It was one of those quiet English afternoons where the clouds rolled in low but didn't bother raining, and the only sound outside was the rustle of apple leaves. I had just finished folding the washing and was about to sit down with a book when she looked up at me with her crayon-stained fingers and said, "Grandma, let's draw." I smiled. "All right, love. What shall we draw today?" She grinned, showing that little gap where her front tooth used to be. A tree, and people under it. I set the kettle aside, poured the tea for later, and sat down at the kitchen table with her. The paper was already set, the crayons scattered like a tiny rainbow explosion. She got to work with such focus. First the tree, wide and generous, with curling branches that reached toward the sun. Then two people beneath it, a man and a woman. She gave the man gray hair and glasses, and the woman a bright purple scarf and a long blue dress. I sipped my tea and watched. "Who are they, darling?" She didn't look up. "It's Grandpa and Grandma." I laughed softly. "Oh, is that me and Grandpa then?" She shook her head without hesitation. "No, Grandma, not you. The other Grandma, Grandma Susan." My hand froze mid-sip. I blinked, slowly, not quite believing what I'd heard. "The other Grandma?" I repeated carefully. She nodded. "Yes, Grandpa said not to tell you." And then she looked up at me, completely innocent, completely sure. They kissed, under a tree, just like in the movies. I set my cup down gently, so gently I didn't even hear it touch the saucer. My ears began to ring, faintly, like they do just before a storm. "Susan?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Lily hummed. "She had the purple scarf. I liked that one. It looks soft." She went back to coloring, completely unaware she'd just turned my entire life upside down. Susan, my best friend of nearly 3 decades, the woman who held my hand through childbirth, through my mother's funeral, through every quiet breakdown life threw at me. I stared at the drawing again. The man had Richard's chin, the woman wore Susan's glasses, and there, on her neck, was the very scarf Susan had worn the last time she came over for dinner. I had complimented it. She'd laughed and said it was a gift from someone special. Dear God! I looked at Lily, who was now humming some song from school, adding yellow daisies around the couple. She had no idea. No idea what her tiny hand had just unearthed. "Sweetheart," I said carefully, "when did you see them like that?" "Last week," she said cheerfully. "After school, Grandpa picked me up. We went to the park. He said we were meeting a friend." It was Grandma Susan. They hugged and kissed and sat on a blanket. I couldn't breathe. Not out of rage. Not yet. But from the weight of how easily the truth had slipped through the mouth of a child. I stood up slowly and walked to the sink. I turned on the tap, let cold water run over my hands, and tried to quiet the roaring in my head. This wasn't a TV show. This wasn't a soap opera. This was my life, my husband, my best friend, my granddaughter, and a kiss under a tree. When I returned to the table, Lily had finished her drawing. She beamed at it like it was her masterpiece. In a way, it was. She held it up to me. "Do you like it, Grandma?" I looked at it, really looked. The two of them beneath the tree, the heart above their heads, the purple scarf. I swallowed the ache rising in my throat. "It's beautiful," I said. "You're very talented." She giggled and pulled another sheet of paper out. "I'm going to draw you and me next." And just like that, she was off again, completely unaware that her first drawing had shattered something sacred. I folded the paper gently, slid it under the old cookbook I kept on the counter. I wasn't ready to look at it again. Not yet. Later that night, once Lily was asleep and the house was quiet, I sat by the window with a blanket over my lap and that drawing in my hand. There was no lipstick-stained collar, no text messages, no lipstick found in the glove box. Just this, a child's depiction of the truth. No one had told her to lie. No one had trained her in deceit. And that's what made it real. I thought of every dinner Susan and I had shared at this very table. Every time she poured wine, laughed too loudly at Richard's jokes, leaned a little too close when she thought I wasn't looking. Had it started recently? Or had it been going on for years? I didn't know. All I knew was this: there were no more excuses to be made, no more coincidences to explain away. The truth had come from the purest source possible, and it cut deeper because of it. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the moon shift across the sky, and I began to plan, not revenge, but truth, for myself, because if they could bury it under a tree, I could unearth it with my silence. The mind does something strange when it's forced to see what it once chose not to. It replays the past, but not kindly, not with nostalgia. It sharpens every moment you dismissed, every glance you ignored, every instinct you swallowed down in the name of trust. After Lily's drawing, I couldn't stop remembering, and suddenly, everything I once called ordinary started looking like evidence. The first memory that came rushing back was last winter. Susan had canceled lunch. We were meant to meet at the tea room in town, our monthly tradition, sacred and rarely broken. But that morning she texted, "Caught something awful, coughing like mad. Next week?" I had smiled at the screen, sympathetic, even offered to drop off some soup. She politely declined, said she didn't want me catching it. Later that afternoon, I saw her in the garden center car park. She didn't see me. She was getting out of Richard's car. She wore sunglasses, even though the sky was thick with clouds. And she laughed as she handed him something. Her scarf, maybe? I couldn't tell. I remember blinking, stunned. I almost honked, but I didn't. Instead, I drove past, told myself I was mistaken. Maybe Richard had given her a lift. Maybe they'd run into each other at the post office. Maybe. I didn't even mention it to Richard that night, because to say it aloud would have required asking a question, and I wasn't ready to hear the answer. Then there was the earring, a silver teardrop stud I found wedged between the seat and the door in Richard's car. I'd been vacuuming it out for him, something I always did in spring. I remember holding it up in the sunlight. It sparkled slightly, feminine, elegant, nothing like the chunky clip-ons I wore. "Is this mine?" I asked later that day, holding it up. Richard barely glanced at it. "Probably Claire's," he said, taking it from me and tossing it into the junk drawer in the kitchen. But Claire hadn't been in that car for months. She lived 2 towns over, took the train everywhere. The earring disappeared by the next morning. I'd told myself I was overthinking. I'd been watching too many detective dramas. Then came the coat. Susan had a long, camel-colored coat, wool, expensive, with those big brown buttons. She'd bought it after her promotion at the publishing house, and she wore it like armor. I always admired it. One chilly morning, I went out to the shed to get the extension lead. Richard's boot was open. He'd just come back from the market. There, half-tucked beneath the spare tire, was a coat. Her coat. I stood there for a full minute, just staring. And then I closed the boot and went inside. I didn't ask, because asking might start something I wasn't ready to finish. I'd rather live with doubt than have to act on confirmation. Or, at least, that's what I thought. Now, with Lily's drawing hidden in my drawer, those doubts became dominoes falling in rapid succession. The scarf, the laughter, the perfume on his collar that wasn't mine, the late meetings that didn't quite add up. The way he changed his passcode last summer, said it was for work emails. Richard hadn't worked in 5 years. I remembered the way Susan once touched his arm at a garden party. It wasn't inappropriate, not on the surface, but it lingered half a second too long. I had noticed and done nothing. Because what woman accuses her husband of an affair with her best friend based on a touch? Now I realized every detail had been a thread, and I had let them knot together until the truth was hidden in plain sight. I sat in the conservatory that night, watching the rain tap against the glass, and let it all replay. All the moments I brushed off, all the excuses I accepted, not because I was naive, but because I was loyal, because I believed love meant assuming the best, because I thought after nearly 4 decades of marriage that I was safe. I was wrong. And that wrongness didn't come with sirens or shouts. It came with small betrayals, with silence, with a drawing from a child who had no reason to lie. I walked to the bookshelf and pulled out our wedding album. Richard and I, 25 and beaming. Susan, just behind me, hands clasped, eyes shining. I flipped the pages slowly, pausing on one photo in particular, our anniversary trip to Cornwall. There we were on the beach, and just behind us, Susan taking the picture. Always there, always watching. And now, I couldn't unsee it, the way she'd been woven into every chapter of our lives. Not as a guest, but, I now feared, as a thief. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how easy it had been for them, how natural, how practiced, like they had done it 100 times. Shared smiles behind my back, exchanged texts while I set the table, kissed beneath trees while I sat at home waiting for the kettle to boil. I pressed the album closed, gently, as though it were a fragile thing. I wasn't angry yet. That would come later, but I was aware, fully, sharply. And there's something powerful about that shift. When a woman moves from doubt to clarity, it's not loud, it's not vengeful, it's the quiet before a decision. And I had just made mine. I would no longer ignore the map that memory had laid before me. I would follow it, not to confront them, not yet, but to reclaim the woman they thought would never see, the one who saw everything, just a little too late. I've always believed that some people enter your life like seasons. They come, they pass, they leave behind color or cold, and then they go. But Susan was different. She wasn't a season. She was the soil beneath the life I built. I met her when Claire was still an infant. I was young, exhausted, and floating in the strange fog of new motherhood. One morning at the community center, she walked over with a tin of shortbread and a smile that didn't feel rehearsed. She sat beside me like she already knew my name, and within minutes, we were laughing like old friends. From that day forward, she became a fixture in my life. She was there when Claire took her first steps, camera ready, cheering louder than even Richard. She brought flowers to my father's funeral, lasagna when I had the flu, and hand cream when I broke down sobbing in the chemist's parking lot the year Mum died. That night I sat on the kitchen floor in my dressing gown, unable to lift a teacup without crying. Susan let herself in. She wrapped me in a blanket, made toast, and sat beside me for hours without speaking. "You're allowed to break," she whispered finally. "I'm here to hold the pieces." And she did. When my marriage to Richard hit its quiet patches, no big fights, just the slow dulling of sparkle, it was Susan who reminded me that companionship was a different kind of romance, that being seen was sometimes more valuable than being desired. "You two are solid," she told me once. "You're the kind of couple that makes people believe in marriage." I held on to those words. Now I know. Sometimes people flatter the life they want to steal. After Lily's drawing, I tried to carry on normally. I tried to pretend the truth hadn't just been sketched out in wax crayon by a child too young to lie. But something inside me cracked. I stopped sleeping. My dreams, once gentle, turned to quicksand. Memories of shared dinners, matching coats, glasses clinking. I couldn't look at my own wedding photos without scanning the corners to see if Susan was there. She always was. I didn't eat much. Toast would go cold. Tea tasted of metal. My body moved through the motions. Brush hair, fold laundry, check mailbox. But my mind was elsewhere, wandering dark halls built of doubt and memory. The worst part wasn't what I saw, it was what I'd missed. All the signs had been there. I just hadn't wanted to believe they were meant for me. And so I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, late one evening, flipping through old letters Susan had sent me, birthday cards, thank you notes, even the one from when Claire got into university. She always signed off the same way. "Forever yours, Susan. Always beside you." I used to read that and feel warmth. Now I read it and felt like a fool, because she had been beside me at every dinner, every family holiday, every picnic with Richard, right beside me, smiling, and slowly, while I wasn't looking, she'd stepped in front. She didn't steal him with passion or seduction. No, that would have been easier to swallow. She stole him with patience, with familiarity, with the long con of intimacy. She didn't climb into my marriage. She tiptoed politely through the front door I'd left open, carrying wine and laughter and a shared history. And Richard? He let her. Because nothing about their betrayal was sudden. It was slow, silent, like rot beneath floorboards. You don't see it until you fall through. I tried to journal one night, something I hadn't done in years. I wrote one sentence and couldn't finish it. I don't know who I miss more, my husband or my friend, because the truth was, I missed both, but neither of them were real anymore. Not as I had known them. The people I missed existed only in memory. I once told Susan everything. My fears about aging, my resentment when Richard retired and forgot how to talk about anything but golf, my guilt about feeling lonely in a full house. She had listened, and she had taken that knowledge, piece by piece, and used it to build a bridge, not to help me across, but to walk away with the man I loved. I don't know what broke me more, Richard's betrayal or Susan's familiarity with the path she took to get there, because she knew exactly where I kept the extra key, exactly when I went out for groceries, exactly how I folded our napkins. The betrayal didn't feel like a stab, it felt like a dismantling. And I was the last to know the house was crumbling. One night I stood in the shower far too long. The water turned cold, but I didn't move. I just stood there, arms crossed, forehead pressed to the tile, repeating one thought: she held my baby before Richard ever did. The depth of that intimacy felt unbearable. Susan hadn't just touched my life, she'd been woven into it, and now I had to unpick her from every memory, like thread from a favorite jumper. It left holes, but I'd rather live with holes than with something that looked whole but wasn't. I started closing the blinds at night, not because I feared them, but because I was finally learning how to protect myself, and I stopped answering her texts. She messaged me twice that week, once with a meme, once with, "Thinking of you. Want to meet for tea?" I stared at the screen for a full 5 minutes. Then I deleted the messages. Because healing, I've learned, isn't always about mending. Sometimes, it's about refusing to be stitched back into a pattern you didn't consent to. Susan had once promised me forever, but the truth is, she was never mine to trust. I waited a week before calling her. Not because I needed more time to process, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to see if she would reach out first. She didn't. No call, no text, no casual invitation to pop in for tea like she used to. Her silence was louder than any confession. It was a Tuesday when I finally picked up the phone. I waited until the house was empty. Claire had taken Lily to visit friends, and I was alone with the echo of my own thoughts. I boiled water, poured a cup of chamomile, and sat down at the kitchen table. The phone in my hand felt heavier than it should. I took a breath. Then I dialed. She answered on the second ring. "Margaret?" Her voice chirped, just slightly too cheerful. "What a surprise. I was just thinking about you." "Were you? I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," I said evenly. No, she replied quickly. "Just folding laundry, you know, never ending." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Claire sent me something this week. A drawing Lily did." There was a slight pause, the kind only noticeable when you're listening for it. "Oh," she said, light and breezy. "She's quite the little artist, that one." "She is," I agreed. "Very detailed. She drew a tree and 2 people sitting under it." Another pause, this one longer. "How sweet," she managed. "Yes," I continued, letting my voice soften like velvet. "A man and a woman, sitting beneath a tree. Kissing, actually." There was no reply. "She said it was Grandpa," I said, "and Grandma Susan." I could hear her swallow through the silence, a faint catch in her breath. Still, she said nothing. "She even remembered your purple scarf," I added. Said it looked soft. I could almost hear her shifting, perhaps sitting down, trying to steady her nerves. I gave her the moment. Then I added, gently, almost like a joke, almost like I might still let her laugh it off. "Funny, though. She said Richard told her to keep it a secret." There it was. Silence. But not the kind of silence that comes from confusion. Not the kind that means, "I don't understand." This silence was saturated with knowledge. It was heavy with guilt, with recognition, with the realization that a child had undone what they had carefully hidden. When someone is wrongly accused, they defend themselves instantly. When someone is guilty, they pause. I let the silence stretch. I wanted her to feel it, not in anger, but in truth. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped half an octave. "Children, they misunderstand things, Margaret." I almost admired the effort, the reach. "Do they?" I replied softly. "Yes. They mix things up," she said, pushing now, trying to sound composed. "You know how their imaginations are, always inventing." "She was quite specific," I said. "The scarf, the kiss, the heart above your heads." Another pause. She wasn't good at this. I imagined her sitting in her living room, phone pressed to her ear, staring at nothing, maybe the same couch Richard had once sat on, maybe still warm from his visits. "I don't know what she saw," she said finally. "But if she said that, I'm sorry, I would never." I stopped her gently. "No need to explain," I said. "It wasn't a confrontation, Susan, just sharing what Claire passed along." I waited. She said nothing more. No denial, no outrage, no laughter at the absurdity of it all. Just silence, a silence full of things she would never admit. And that was all I needed. I stood up and walked to the sink, holding the phone to my ear. Then I said the last words I would ever speak to her. "I think this is the part where you stop pretending." And before she could respond, I gently ended the call. No click, no drama. Just a quiet goodbye wrapped in truth. I placed the phone on the counter, took a sip of my now cool tea, and looked out at the garden. It was the same view as always, but somehow I saw everything differently. Susan's silence had said more than any words ever could. It had confessed, fully, without fanfare, and I didn't need to hear "I'm sorry," because the woman I had been, the one who needed explanations, who sought closure, she didn't live here anymore. The woman standing in her place had found something far more valuable. Her voice. It was a gray morning, the kind that sits heavy on your chest before you even open the curtains. I hadn't planned it, but there are moments when your feet move before your mind can intervene, and suddenly you're halfway down the road, holding a folded piece of paper in your coat pocket like a secret, too tired to stay hidden. Susan lived just 4 streets over. I'd walked that path hundreds of times before. With scones wrapped in foil, with birthday cards, with stories I couldn't wait to tell her. But never like this. This time, I walked like a witness carrying evidence. Not because I needed to prosecute, but because I needed to return what never belonged to her. When I reached her front door, I didn't hesitate. I knocked twice, firmly, like I had every right to be there. Because I did. The door opened slowly, as if it knew what was coming. Susan stood there. In her house slippers and a navy cardigan I recognized from a shopping trip we took years ago. Her face froze the moment she saw me. Not surprised, no, not surprised, just caught. "Margaret," she said, her voice barely audible. I wasn't expecting—" "No," I said calmly, "you wouldn't be." She stepped aside without asking. Her eyes darted behind her, and that's when I saw him. Richard. He was standing in her living room, not 3 steps from the doorway. His jumper was rumpled, as though he'd only just sat up from her sofa. His face went pale the second our eyes met. No words passed between us. They didn't need to. I walked in. No pleasantries, no greetings, just the quiet creak of my shoes on her polished floor. I stopped in the center of the room, the same room I'd helped her paint that ridiculous pale yellow years ago, the same room where I'd once laughed over red wine, holding her hand after her divorce. And now it held something else, something rotten. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the folded drawing. I placed it on the table between us, slowly unfolding it like it was sacred. Lily's crayon masterpiece. The tree, the scarf, the kiss. Susan stared at it, her lips parting slightly. Richard looked away. "She drew it last week," I said, my voice calm. "She said you kissed under the tree. Said Richard told her to keep it a secret." Neither of them spoke. I turned to Richard. "Did you?" He didn't look up. His shoulders sank, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw him for what he was. Not strong, not silent, just small. I turned back to Susan. "We've known each other 30 years, I said. "You were there when Claire was born. You held me when my mother died. You sat at my kitchen table and called me your sister." Her eyes were filling with tears, but I didn't care. "You didn't just betray me," I said. "You watched me trust you, every single day, and you still went behind my back." Still, they said nothing. Because what do you say when you've been caught, not by a detective, but by a child with a box of crayons? I stepped closer, not out of anger, but because I needed to look her in the eyes when I said it. 30 years of friendship, I whispered, and you both broke it with 1 kiss. Her lips trembled. Richard shifted as if to speak. I held up a hand. "Don't." I didn't want apologies. Apologies are for accidents. This was never an accident. It was built, chosen, protected. I walked to the door, slowly, without drama. My hand on the knob, I turned once more. "I won't scream. I won't gossip. I won't set fire to your lives." And then, almost kindly, I added, "But I will never forget what you took from me." With that, I opened the door. Behind me, they stood in their silence, like children in a room that had just lost its air. I walked out, closed the door gently, and stepped into the cold. There was no need to look back. because whatever remained in that house behind me wasn't worth seeing again. Let them sit with their shame. Let them carry the weight. I had carried enough for all three of us. The day I moved out, I didn't cry. There was no scene, no shouting match, no shattered glass on the kitchen floor. I simply woke up, packed 3 suitcases, and left the house Richard and I had lived in for 37 years. It was the same house where I baked birthday cakes, ironed his shirts, hosted holidays, and nursed his fevers. The same house where I once believed nothing could touch us. The same walls that had heard every laugh and secret between Susan and me. Now those walls held only echoes of things I no longer trusted. I didn't leave because I was broken. I left because I was whole enough to know I deserved better. The cottage had sat empty since my mother passed. It wasn't much, small, with low ceilings and windows that rattled in the wind, but it was mine. No one had ever lied to me within those walls. No one had kissed someone else behind closed doors. It held only the quiet scent of lavender and books, and memories of a woman who taught me how to stand on my own. I hired a local moving service. Claire offered to help, but I asked her not to. I needed to do this myself. I wasn't leaving in shame. I was walking out with my spine straight and my silence intact. When the sale of the house went through, the solicitor asked gently, "Would you like to list Richard as co-seller?" I shook my head. "It's in my name, always has been." He blinked, then nodded, filing the papers. Just like that, the chapter closed. No arguments over assets, no pleas. Richard didn't call. I imagined Susan was still there, watching the mail, wondering if I'd come after them. I didn't. I had no interest in revenge. I was far too busy building something new. The cottage needed work, but nothing I couldn't handle. I painted the living room a soft olive green. I scrubbed the kitchen tiles with lemon oil until they gleamed. I hung up photographs of Claire and Lily. New ones, not touched by the past. Every Friday, I picked Lily up from school. Every Saturday, we painted. It started with a small notebook. I gave her a set of watercolor pencils and told her she could draw whatever she liked. She chose stars and cats and stick figures in tutus. I tried to copy her style at first, clumsy and loose, but soon I began sketching landscapes, rolling hills, apple trees, winding roads that led to nowhere in particular. It wasn't art, it was freedom. She'd sit beside me, head bent in concentration, and ask questions like, "Why do birds fly away in winter?" Or, "Do you think trees talk to each other?" And I'd answer, sometimes with truth, sometimes with magic. I watched her world unfold through colors and mine unfold beside hers. I had never realized how healing it could be to start over with no one watching, to wake up and not wonder if someone was lying next to you, to eat toast at midnight, to hang wind chimes without asking anyone's opinion. For the first time in years, I heard my own thoughts, and they were kind. Claire came to visit often. At first, there was a hesitation in her eyes, as if she didn't quite know how to treat this new version of me, but over time that faded. One Sunday morning she looked around the cottage and said, "You look lighter here." I smiled. "That's because I am." I didn't miss Richard, not the man he had become. I missed the idea of him, the man who used to bring me daffodils in spring, the one who rubbed my back during Claire's long labor. But I'd learned that sometimes the person we miss never really existed. They were just the version we built to survive the years beside them. Susan? I didn't miss her at all. I had spent so long believing that friendship meant forgiveness, that loyalty meant swallowing pain. But loyalty, I learned, isn't about how long you stand beside someone. It's about whether they deserve your company to begin with. And neither of them did. One morning, I stood by the kitchen window, watching the wind play with the curtains, and realized I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for closure, not for apologies, not for someone to understand. I didn't need understanding. I needed peace, and I had found it. It wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with a marching band or a grand realization. It came with freshly baked scones, with Lily's laughter echoing in the garden, with the feel of a paintbrush in my hand. It came with stillness, with choosing myself. I planted roses along the back fence that spring. Mom had always loved roses. She used to say, "They look delicate, but you should see how deep their roots go." I think I finally understood what she meant. I wasn't fragile. I was planted, rooted in a truth no one could take from me. not with kisses or lies or betrayal wrapped in a friend's smile. I wasn't rebuilding the life I had lost. I was creating one that had never been allowed to bloom before, and this time I wouldn't apologize for how brightly it blossomed. It had been a year since I walked out of the house on Wren Hill. A full turn of seasons had come and gone. The rose bushes I planted behind the cottage had bloomed once, died back, and begun to stir again. I baked bread on Sundays. I painted every Friday with Lily. I went to bed without checking my phone. I slept soundly for the first time in decades. Peace, I had learned, doesn't arrive with fanfare. It moves in gently, like the tide coming to claim what's always been its own. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, the phone rang. I was in the kitchen kneading dough, sleeves rolled up, hands dusted in flour. Claire was due in an hour with Lily, and I was making cinnamon rolls for their visit. The landline buzzed, an unfamiliar number but local. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and answered, "Hello?" A pause, then a voice I hadn't heard in nearly 12 months. "Margaret!" I froze. It was Richard. His voice was thinner now, fragile. It sounded like it had been poured through a sieve. "I'm in the hospital," he said after a pause. "They said it was a minor stroke, nothing permanent. I'll recover, but I can't do much on my own right now." I didn't speak. "I called Susan first," he said, a bitter chuckle behind his words. "But she's gone. Packed up. Said she needed to find herself, left without a word." I closed my eyes. Of course she did. "She left me," he said again. "I haven't heard from her in weeks." Another silence, and then, "I need someone, Margaret." I kept quiet. He took a breath, unsteady. "I need you." There it was. Not an apology, not really, just a request, dressed up as regret. He continued, his voice a whisper now. "You were always there, always steady, always kind, didn't. I didn't know how much that meant until it wasn't there anymore." I walked to the sink and looked out at the garden. The apple tree was just beginning to bloom. Lily had drawn it last week, me and her beneath it again, holding ice cream cones, a heart-shaped kite above our heads. She hadn't drawn Richard once in months. I remembered what she told me after her last sleepover. "You smile more now, Grandma." And I did, because I no longer lived beneath the weight of being needed without being valued. I brought the phone back to my ear, calm and clear. "You had me," I said gently, "for 37 years. You had my patience, my loyalty, my silence." He didn't interrupt. "And you traded me," I continued, "for a lie, for convenience, for comfort. You thought I'd be here forever no matter what." Another pause. I could hear the hospital sounds in the background, the distant beep of machines, the muffled voices of nurses. The world around him had shrunk to a bed, a call button, and a phone. I didn't speak out of cruelty, I spoke out of truth. "I'm not for trade anymore, Richard. I'm not the emergency number you call when your choices collapse." He breathed in sharply. "Please," he whispered. "I don't want to be alone." "You chose to be alone," I said. "The moment you let her sit in my chair, the moment you smiled at her instead of stopping her, the moment you let me become optional. No shouting, no rage, just clarity. I'm not angry anymore," I added. "But I'm also not yours." The line went quiet again. I waited a moment longer, then spoke the last words I would ever say to him. "Goodbye, Richard." Then I placed the phone gently on the table, not with a slam, not in defiance, but like laying down a flower on a grave. Not because the love was still alive, but because the morning had ended, and I had somewhere else to be. The sky was bright that morning, even though it was still early spring. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains in soft patterns across the wooden floor. The kettle hummed behind me, and Lily sat cross-legged on the rug in her favorite spot by the window. Crayons spread around her like petals. She had come to stay for the weekend, again. Claire had an out-of-town conference, and Lily had insisted, "I want to stay with Grandma Margaret. She lets me paint." As if that were the only reason. I watched her quietly as she drew. Her tongue was tucked into the corner of her mouth the way it always was when she was concentrating. She didn't look up, didn't speak, just kept drawing. Her world, as always, poured itself onto paper. After a while, she stood up, holding her newest creation with both hands. "Look, Grandma!" I set my tea down and took the picture. It was a tree again, the apple tree in my garden, clearly. And beneath it, 2 figures holding hands. One tall, with silver hair pulled into a bun. One small, with pigtails and a wide smile. Me. And her. I smiled. This is beautiful, darling. Is that us under the tree? She nodded proudly. It's you and me, Grandma and Lily. I studied the picture. Something tugged at me. There was no Grandpa in it. I asked gently, "Why didn't you draw Grandpa this time?" She looked at me, calm and thoughtful. "Because you smile more now, Grandma." I sat very still, the paper soft in my hands. Children say things with a clarity adults spend years trying to reach. I pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "Thank you, sweetheart." Later, when she was busy building castles with cushions and blankets, I looked at the picture again. The tree was full of apples. The grass was dotted with yellow flowers. We were holding hands, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like something or someone was missing. That night, after Lily had gone to sleep, I stood outside the cottage and looked up at the stars. There was no echo of Richard in these walls, no trace of Susan's laughter, only the hum of crickets and the rustle of trees. I thought about all I had lost, and then all I had gained. I had lost a husband, yes. I had lost a best friend, yes. But I had gained myself, the version of me who no longer apologized for her quiet, who no longer accepted half-truths or half-love, who no longer waited by the phone for people who had proven they didn't deserve her time. I painted every Saturday now, sometimes with Lily, sometimes alone. My fingers knew the curves of trees better than the curves of a man's excuses. I tended the roses behind the house, the ones Mum planted, the ones I once thought too stubborn to bloom. They bloomed just fine when I stopped trying to make them fit someone else's schedule. Claire noticed the change too. One Sunday over coffee, she said, "You seem taller lately." I laughed. That's what happens when you stop carrying everyone else. Life didn't become perfect, but it became honest. It became mine. And that was enough. That was everything. I never answered another call from Richard. The hospital sent a letter once, something about his discharge needing assistance. I placed it, unopened, in a drawer, and never thought of it again. Susan never reached out again either, perhaps because she knew there was nothing left for her to return to. And I didn't wait for closure, because sometimes the most powerful ending is no ending at all, just walking away with grace. Now, when I look at Lily's drawings on my fridge, I don't see what's missing. I see what remains. A woman and a child beneath a tree. No shadows, no secrets, just sunlight, color, and a future that belongs only to us. She asked me recently, "Do you ever get lonely, Grandma?" I smiled and pulled her into my lap. Not anymore. Because I am surrounded by the life I created, not the one I was told to keep. Not the one I was made to endure, but the life I chose. A life where silence no longer hides pain, where smiles aren't rehearsed, where every drawing is a page from a new chapter, drawn by steady hands and a heart finally free. If you've ever been betrayed by the people closest to you, if you've ever stayed silent because you thought sacrifice was a woman's duty, then you are not alone. This is Grandma True Stories. Hit subscribe and let your scars become stories the world finally hears.